Okay, I'm joined by contributing writer Jake Fogelman now to talk about another story that Jake, you wrote this week that is pretty interesting. It dovetails with the Uvalde police response, and it's about, I think, a situation that maybe a lot of people hadn't heard of, or maybe they heard about this briefly when it happened, but haven't been up to date on the details of what went down with this particular shooting in Colorado. So can you give us a little more information about what exactly is happening now?
Yeah, sure. So this is a story that hits a little close to home for me. This is happened about a half hour from where I live. About a year ago, just almost exactly a year ago, for background for listeners, a deranged guy with a anti-police animus went into a crowded shopping center in Arvada, Colorado, which is just north of Denver, with a shotgun and an AR-15. And he set out basically to shoot as many cops as he could. And he actually ended up ambushing a police officer that was responding when folks saw this guy. So very tragic situation. And he waited on scene after he killed that police officer to confront any other responding officers. Well, nearby, shopping at this shopping center was an armed citizen who had a concealed carry permit. He just happened to be there. He heard the shots. He stepped out, confronted this guy, shot him 6 times, and ended up killing him. Well, it turns out that the responding police officers that came afterwards mistook this armed citizen as the shooter or something along those lines, ended up killing him. So now fast forward 1 year, and the mother of that armed citizen is now suing that police department because some troubling details have come out about how that all transpired. That kind of calls into question the officer's actions here. They said that there's a link or a quote here from the lawsuit that kind of sums it up. It says, Mr. Hurley, who's the armed citizen, his death was not the result of a misfortunate split-second judgment call gone wrong, but the result of a deliberate and unlawful use of deadly force. So essentially, they're alleging that the responding officers didn't announce that they were police, didn't give this guy a chance to show that, hey, I'm not a threat, put my gun down, I'm not a threat. And they just kind of showed up and shot him. So kind of troubling in the wake of the Uvalde shooting. We're seeing a lot of public scrutiny on police officers responding to active shooter situations. Obviously, they're very chaotic and troubling situations, but certainly it's another, not a great incident to see.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and some of the details here are particularly concerning, just like we're learning about the police response to Uvalde and how horrendous that was, frankly. Waiting an hour to go in, like even to the point where they were disarming a fellow officer whose wife was bleeding out in the inside of the classroom. They stopped him from going in and took his gun away. So that's big part of the news right now is this absurd, unthinkable response in Uvalde. And now here's a reminder that this is not the first time that something like this has gone terribly wrong. I mean, you have a guy who saved a bunch of officers' lives, frankly, by stopping the murderer who was trying to kill them. And Then in turn, they killed him. And look, obviously there's a case of mistaken identity going on here, perhaps, or almost certainly. I don't think anyone's alleging that this officer knew that this heroic concealed carrier wasn't the shooter, right? But the allegation is like they ought to have figured it out in the time frame that they were there before the shots were taken, because it was something like he watched him for something like 11 seconds, if I remember the detail in the story correctly, before taking the shot. And also, hadn't they arrived and they were hiding?
I was just going to say what adds to the kind of the troubling aspect of this is that 3 officers, there's actually a substation, an Arvada police substation at this shopping center, just because it's a high traffic area. And apparently while the initial shots, when the first officer got ambushed, broke out, 3 officers spotted the shooter, but took cover because they were concerned that he had a long gun and they only had handguns. And so they just hid in the substation while the shooting happened. And this armed citizen comes out and takes this guy down. And then they only leave once they see the armed citizen going down to secure the rifle that the bad guy dropped, obviously, once he was no longer a threat. According to the lawsuit, he was allegedly removing the magazine and clearing the chamber when he was shot. So just
Yeah, that's
all around bad.
that is remarkable. You know, you have a situation where the police are under attack, and a armed civilian is the only one who actually does the proper thing, which is to try and neutralize the active shooter as quickly as possible with whatever means he has, which in this case was himself a pistol. He didn't have a rifle, and he still went to shoot and successfully subdued this attacker, only to be killed by the police he was defending. I mean, geez, yeah, that's a rough situation, and you know, also one where, frankly, it's unlikely that this lawsuit succeeds. Just my personal opinion here. We don't get into personal opinion a lot, but judging by how difficult it is to actually, hold police accountable for these sorts of shootings or for their own inaction, as we're seeing in Uvalde, where it's unlikely that anything significant is going to happen to any of those officers either. But it's very unlikely that this lawsuit succeeds, I think.
I tend to agree, but I will just jump in real quick. Colorado actually 2 years ago repealed qualified immunity in the state. So I think that's one thing that provides maybe a slight nugget that you could get some sort of accountability here. But I agree, the odds of it are still kind of a long shot. But
yeah, I just think that the circumstances are too murky.
Yeah,
in terms of proving that this was not. This sounds like it was on the outer limits of what's a reasonable shoot would be like.
Yeah,
because there was an active shooter. The police officer saw a man with a rifle and just assumed that he was the active shooter. That was obviously the wrong assumption and poor decision making on his part. But I think it's going to be difficult to actually hold him legally responsible for that, because it's very difficult, frankly, even without qualified immunity, to hold police responsible for these sorts of incidents. It just is. That's just the reality everywhere in the United States, not just Colorado or Texas or wherever, but that's how things work. And I think it's unfortunate too, because you got two high profile now incidents where the police were absolutely derelict in their response to a active shooter, and it paints a very negative light on law enforcement when, there are many cases where police do the proper thing in responding to these sorts of shootings. Even just the hospital shooting that occurred after Uvalde is a perfectly good example of that. They actually went in immediately and confronted the shooter, and the shooting was over within 30 seconds of them arriving.
Right.
And that's a fairly common story. These sorts of stories are less common, but they're so tragic and horrible, and there's such a lack of consequence for the people who made the poor decisions that it's something that we have to talk about.
No, absolutely, and it's worth noting this officer that shot the armed citizen was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing by the district attorney in this case. So there's no legal ramifications other than whatever the long odds are of this lawsuit. So just for the listeners' awareness. Right.
Yeah. And that's a good point to make. But he did resign, I guess, this officer.
Yeah.
Although isn't there a comment about the police department would love to have him back?
Yeah. Some local reporting here in Colorado uncovered a statement that said we would take him back if he wanted to come back, because I guess he resigned of his own volition after the investigation into his shoot. So
yeah, see, that's I think what I'm talking about. Like, often these police officers don't even lose their jobs when they make horrible mistakes, or wouldn't lose their jobs, or would be welcomed back if they resigned. It's the same thing in Uvalde. All those officers are still, as of now, in the police department. They stood in the hallway for an hour while children were slaughtered, but that's not a fireable offense, apparently.
Right.
So it just makes people, makes you wonder what is a fireable offense.
Right.
And that's the hard part. Obviously, you don't want to put law enforcement in a situation where they're constantly being second guessed about everything, but there also needs to be some level of accountability here, right? I mean, that's the problem we run into.